Hello, it's Ren Presents time. I'm your host, Ren, and today we continue with the Hazards of the Old Ones, Part 2, Chapter 9, The Hazards of the Old Ones. So last week, we saw the Stellar Marines and the fleet making their pitches, respectively, to Captain Davidge as a replacement first officer for the wayward Lieutenant Kylos. We met Lieutenant Verlin of the 53rd Marines, who looks a lot like Kai physically. She's a tall, thin, blonde-headed lady, kind of similar to Kai, but much more regal, much more done up than Kai ever did. She never really worried about stuff like that, always rather wind-blown. And Captain Davidge was suitably impressed. Lieutenant Verlin mentioned seeing the aftermath of the Battle of Marendra III, the second Battle of Marendra III, through her brother's telescope, and she saw the fleet ships returning to Kana, many damaged, blackened by battle, some never returning at all, and how she felt the need to serve the League as a member of the fleet, or in this case, the Marines. And we find out later why Lieutenant Verlin is a Marine and not in the fleet. And that revelation, touched Captain Davidge, because he was part of Marendra III. And Marendra III, the second battle of Marendra III, there was two of them, was a battle between the fleet and the League, basically, and the Zafin Armada. And it was a high point, a high watermark in the power of the Zafin Armada. The Zafins, the five Zafins who they worshipped, had created thousands upon thousands of ships for them to fly around in, and they threw all this weight at the fleet at Marendra. In the first part, the first battle of Marendra III, the fleet was sent packing, basically. The fleet had to regroup and rethink its strategy and come at them again. And in the second battle, the fleet triumphed. Barely. And after that, the Zafins didn't have the power or the energy to recreate such a vast armada, and the Zafins basically faded in power, became much more austere, very territorial, very tribal, lots of warlords. They were never united again like they were at Marendra. And Lieutenant Verlin witnessed this as a little girl through her brother's telescope. We also met Lieutenant Larson of the fleet and Captain Davidge. They exchanged Los Capricos weapons, and those are specific to each house. Lieutenant Larson has a little stick in his coat that expands to an electrified full-size javelin known as the Great Door, and Captain Davidge appreciates that. He found no fault in either of them and bade them both stay aboard and serve as dual acting first officers, and eventually one of them will have merit over the other, and he doesn't really know. And Sig was pissed way off, and she was pummeling Captain Davidge with telepathy, like, let me the hell in, or I'm gonna blast this door down and I'm gonna make a stink in front of everybody. She hates being left out. She likes to participate, even if it's not really proper for her to do so. Shutting her out of his office is guaranteed to tweak her way off. This week, we find out at last what Carahil had in mind for Lieutenant Kylos. This week, lots of world building, lots of lore, and I love that sort of thing. You can't have a rich fantasy, completely made-up world without world building, and you get a lot of that in this chapter. You get tales of the sisters and the old league and of scary places, ghost stories, if you will, artifacts, mystical artifacts floating about the league. We get all that in this chapter right here. We also get told the tale of the Black Abbess and the horrible things that she did, and we'll go through all that at the end of the chapter. Until then, let's proceed immediately. Part 2, Chapter 9, The Hazards of the Old Ones. After an hour or so, Carahil descended through the layers of light clouds. Though it hadn't felt like it, they must have traveled far. The ubiquitous northern chill was gone, replaced with a comfortable, temperate climate that was much more to Kai's liking. The mountains rising up all around were also different. Not the bare, jagged, cornice-laced peaks of the Canaan north. These were gentler, covered with purplish growth, overlooking vast conifer forests and quiet lakes. A very lovely area, all in all. He shook his silver head and scratched. He looked around and made his book appear, consulted it, and then made it vanish just as quickly. "Any thoughts as to where we are, Kylos?" he asked, shrinking back down to his usual smallish size. She looked around. The surroundings looked familiar to her, but she couldn't place it. It sort of reminded her of her home, of Tusk, of Wild Onaris. "No," she said finally. "Nice area. Pretty." Carahil patiently lifted a flipper. "Yes, very pretty. That way, about 10 miles yonder, are the Tartan Plains. Several old Vith chapels lying in ruin. Very lovely setting for young lovers. The solitude, the mountains, the flowers, the picturesque ruins." Kai squinted her eyes. Way off to the south, she thought she could see the low, spread-out remains and stony ruins of a Vith chapel, scattered before the edge of a dark green forest. She could make out the remnant of a dry riverbed running from the ruins to pretty much right where she was standing. The edges of the ancient riverbed were marked at regular lengths by flat objects overgrown with weeds. "Oh, the Tartan Plains. I remember Dav taking Demona of Ryle there once on an outing. Is that where we're headed? Never been there myself." "No, Kylos." He pointed with a flipper in the opposite direction. "That's where we're headed. Right there." Through a stand of trees to the north were the bases of several tall, purple mountains, about a half-mile distant. Dug into the bases of the mountains were 6 black holes. Even at this distance, the holes were the murkiest patches of midnight she'd ever seen. Carahil began loping towards the mountains, with Kai reluctantly following. "Those holes, what are those?" she asked. "They're called the hazards of the old ones." Kai stopped dead in her tracks. She swallowed. "I've heard of those. Dav told me about them. He warned me about them." Movement in the trees caught her eye. She thought she saw a small, long-armed creature hanging in the branches. "I see," Carahil said, stopping. "And what did Lord Blanchford tell you?" The wind picked up a little, a gentle, comfortable breeze. The trees swayed a bit. A strange pink bird with a long neck and stilt-like legs took flight and winged its way north. Ahead was another flat, overgrown object dotting the edge of the old riverbed that she'd seen running along its length. Kai approached it and knelt down, pretending to examine it. Something jumped out of the growth and nearly stopped her heart. It was a cat that spat at her and darted away into the trees. Kai put her hands into the tangle of weeds the cat had been hiding in. The old growth was convenient. It hid her fingers, her shaking fingers. "The hazards of the old ones, Kylos?" Carahil asked. She couldn't make her hands stop shaking, and she was determined to hide it. They're tunnels of some sort, right? I also remember Dav saying something about strange animals coming from the hazards of the old ones." She looked around. "That must be it. I saw a weird pink bird and a cat, and something hanging in the branches. Right?" Carahil laughed. "That was a monkey in the trees, and you missed the elephant." "Elephant?" she said. "Yes. I believe you're referring to the grand animaliums. That one of them is said to reside hidden in this area, and you and Lord Blanchford are correct. There is one hidden around here somewhere. All sorts of novel animals come wandering out of it, but that isn't really related to the hazards per se. What else do you know?" "They're evil. That's what we say back home." Carahil watched her examine the growth. "Evil? We've got all sorts of stories about them in Tusk. There's something inside, something hidden in the dark, as so the stories go. My parents used to say the devil lived in them. Davs told me that the great lords used to come here to test their bravery, to see how far they could get before turning back. He said nobody ever gets more than a few paces in. Even Dav couldn't get far. He said he saw something in the dark with his sight. Indeed he did. And to bring you up to date, the great lords no longer make a show of attempting to enter the hazards. That was too disturbing and the fad fell out of favor. They now have refined the practice to simply having lunch in this area, a hazard lunch, as it's aptly called. Very quaint. She heard a shrill cry off in the distance.
Zow! Zow!
An animal making noise. It stabbed Kai in the soul. Suddenly, the simple act of merely eating lunch in this area seemed a real test of bravery. She had to take her hat off to the great lords after all. She wished she could get on Carahil's back and take off. Forget this place. Forget lunch.
Zow!
Came another shriek. Tasting bile in her mouth, she turned back to the growth, pretending to be interested in it. She cleared the growth and twisted vines away. A plain stone platform was revealed. Cracked, overturned, obviously very old. It was decorated with some sort of strange, twisting writing. She thought that she could make out the stained image of footprints on the platform's face. Kylos, Carahil said over her shoulder, would you care to come with me, please? She didn't move. She sat rooted at the platform. I think I should tell you, he said. The message sender who's been leaving you and the Countess little notes all over the place is here with us. Kai reacted, whipping her head around. Mayax? Yes, he's here too. Carahil turned and began loping away toward the distant holes in the mountains. The picture she saw in the book, the scary one, flashed through her mind. She got up and quickly followed him. Are we in danger? That depends, he replied. They reached a break in the trees, their branches bobbing in the wind. Ahead, looming 60 feet high, were the 6 rough-hewn black holes bored into the base of 3 mountains. They were spaced out about 500 feet apart. Kai could feel the darkness pouring out of them. What are we doing here? She asked. Are we gonna have lunch? Or something? We, Kylos, are going into one of these tunnels. We are? Yes. And I'm supposed to assist you in some way once we're inside? Yes. I think you've got the wrong girl. I'm pretty sure you've got the wrong girl, she thought frantically, trying to appear poised and nonchalant. Not really sure how I can help you here, Carahil, she said. No, I've got the right girl, no doubt about it, he replied, as if responding to her thoughts instead of her words. Kai felt the hair standing up on the back of her head. She felt her legs locking. She kept her feet moving and rocked from side to side. A hazard's lunch. She doubted she could finish a lunch here or even gen up an appetite. She wanted to be miles away. She wanted to be back on the Seeker or in her bed, safe and hidden away in Pendar Tower. Came the animal cry again. Coming from Onaris, Kylos grew up with all sorts of stories of their rich celestial neighbors on Kana, dirt poor, dressed in rags. She and her huge family didn't have much in terms of material and technological items. Sitting in the dark, for they couldn't afford lighting either, they told stories. The stories often spoke of Kana, and they usually weren't flattering. Kana, where the blues lived. Those demented, blue-haired souls armed with the gifts of the mind, playing at being gods, usurping the elders themselves. Kana, where the Johnnies from Onaris worked as lowly servants, toiled for the blues, cooked for them, fought and died for them. Being a Marine, being the best friend of a famous Blue Lord, and having seen much of Kana herself, she now thought of the place as a second home. The home of her best friend, and all those old, unflattering stories she remembered seemed silly and quaint. As a girl, she recalled being terrified of Kana, the monsters that were there on Kana, the giants on Kana. She realized that you never really stopped being afraid of things that scared you as a child. The fear is trussed up, pushed to the side, and rationalized away, but it's still there, just waiting to come out. The gates to hell are on Kana. Those stories used to keep her up at night. And here they are, the hazards of the old ones. Impossible, but look. Carahil, I don't see any productive reason to go into these holes. He put his nose down and gently began nudging her towards the openings again. Oh, but I do. Come now, where's that Johnny skepticism you're so famous for? What could possibly be so bad down there in the dark? Oh, it's pitch black. We could walk off a ledge or get brained on a low hang. For safety's sake, we ought not go in there. Safety. Yes, that sounded good. Carahil looked at her and smiled with his seal face. Please, I can see just fine. I'll guide us. And I'll make sure to say duck if we come across a low hang. Kai felt like running, but managed to control herself. They passed through the trees, and soon they were standing right in front of the middle tunnels. The orange circular walls of the tunnel were tiled from top to bottom. The tiles were covered with some sort of strange writing she didn't recognize. It wasn't Vith, which though she couldn't read or write, she could recognize easily enough. This writing was elongated and twisting and rather unpleasant to look at. What's this writing? She asked. It's Magravine. Never heard of it. It's an old language, an extinct one. The sisters once spoke it back way ages ago when they still used their mouths to speak. They used it to guard their knowledge from the troublesome Vith. Always secretive, the sisters, even back then. The Grand Abbess of Magravine developed the language. You know who she is, correct? Kai thought a moment. She was the founder of the Black Hats, right? Kai said in a questioning fashion, even though she knew perfectly well who the Black Abbess was. The Black Abbess was a big celebrity on Onaris, a fixture of their fears and folklore, a demon in female form. She was the embodiment of evil that you could blame virtually anything on. Something bad has happened to you? The Black Abbess did it. Not was, Carahil said, correcting. She is the leader of the Black Hats. I believe Lord Blanchford had the pleasure of meeting her some time back. She's still alive? That would make her thousands of years old, right? Correct. Your math is impeccable. So here we are in this lonely place of strange wandering animals and whispering winds, where the Black Abbess once walked. Shall I tell you what happened here long ago? Kai was about to say no thank you when Carahil cleared his throat and began telling the story anyway. It was here, he said, ages ago, that Magravine and a few of her demented followers began experimenting with shadow tech. Something stirred in the trees. Kai whirled to look, but she didn't see anything. Carahil, apparently unconcerned, continued. This region has always carried an odd air about it. It was once thought that a precursor city stood here in the mountain passes, populated by strange folk who fled the coming of the elders. Then, of course, there's the Grand Animalium connection, whose defenses are said to affect the mind and alter perception in various ways. Carahil pointed with his flipper to the temple ruins through the trees. Far to the south, the wonderful afternoon setting began to take on an ominous light. That ruined temple yonder to the south, where young lovers today enjoy the sights, is where it all happened, where they were taken. Those poor Vith girls. That's where the Vith eventually came in force and knocked it to the ground, trying to rub out the memory of what had been done there. In those days, as the elders orbited the skies, shadow tech was nothing more than a crude brown substance that issued from the orifices of various Vith females of the line of Subra of the Mark. It came out of their eyes mostly. They wept a brown, mild form of it. The sisterhood noticed that sometimes these dark tears floated and darted about, that the girls could make the tears dance if they tried very hard. The Vith also found that these odd tears could be extruded and worked into simple things. It was a minor inconvenience and novelty, nothing more. The Grand Abbess of Magravine, though, became obsessed with it. She was always so jealous of her elder sister Subra, and was convinced that this odd, messy substance was the ultimate gift, the ultimate power. It just needed proper cultivating. She began seizing the Vith females who could create it and experimented on them, tortured them, dissecting them out in the sunshine, flowers, and mild breezes of the Tartan Temple. She found that the more pain and suffering she created in them, the more focused and potent Shadowtech became. It turned black. It flew. It became poisonous. It seethed with life. And as a side benefit, Magravine also discovered that she enjoyed hurting those girls, that she enjoyed inflicting pain. The Vith, once they discovered what was happening, were dumbfounded. They were innocents at that point in time, before the giants came. They'd never seen such a thing, such brazen, unwashed cruelty. Even the main body of the Sisterhood didn't quite know what to do. They went to the elders orbiting high overhead and asked for help, and the elders, in a typical fashion, told them to remedy the problem themselves. So they went to Magravine and asked her to stop, pleaded with her to stop. She simply laughed and continued, daring them to challenge her. Magravine's power among the 25 Grand Abbesses was unmatched, and her work continued. She discovered the Shadow Mark and the genetic markers that governed its use. The Sisterhood, afraid to face Magravine in a direct conflict, tried to save the Vith by breeding Shadowtech out of existence. Once it was extinct, they reasoned Magravine would forget all about it and turn her interests elsewhere. But Magravine was undeterred. Even as the Sisterhood tried to breed Shadowtech out of existence, Magravine undertook steps to breed it right back in again, the two sides working against each other and getting nowhere. Discovering the existence of Invernans, the Shadowtech males, who can pass the trait down to their female progeny, she enslaved those she could get her hands on and murdered the ones she couldn't. As her slaves, she sent them to her bidding to create by force as many Shadowtech females as was possible. In time, she discovered that these poor Shadowtech females continued to create the substance even after death if their bodies were properly treated. She created a whole dark forest, the landscape of Tithmas, dead female bodies posed to resemble trees and oozing Shadowtech sap. Tithmas, Kai shuddered at the name, the forest of the dead by the Black Lake. All the old stories were ramming their way out of the furnace of her inner mind and burning bright right in front of her. The pink bird was back, running around just within the line of trees. Carahil continued. In time, the forest of Tithmas created so much Shadowtech that a lake of it began to form. Magravine bored 6 holes into the mountains before us and dug out the riverbed we now stand in. The Shadowtech lake flowed from Tithmas and poured into the holes in the mountains, where she could store it indefinitely. The river she created was once lined with dead Vith girls posed on stone platforms. Recall the one you were looking at not long ago. The river of Shadowtech was called Tarbor. Ever heard of it? Kai winced. She knew the name. Tarbor, the road to hell. The dry riverbed she saw, the one she was standing in, the platforms lining its side, the one she just touched once supported the feet of a dead Vith girl spewing Shadowtech. She cringed. All the things she was told as a child but thought were just frightening stories. All true. All true. Something big moved through the trees. Kai couldn't see what it was. A huge squared-off machine or something. Carahil, unmindful, relentlessly continued. Eventually, the sisters and the Vith had enough. The Vith, under the leadership of Holt of the Mountain, and the remaining 24 Grand Abbesses rallied and attacked. Weeping, they burnt the forest of Tithmas to the ground, and with their combined strength destroyed the Tartan Temple and drove Magravine and her followers into the holes in the mountains. There in the darkness she became the Black Abbess, a demon of pain and delights. The Vith, in rage and fear, also destroyed her temple at Magravine for good measure. They thought they had beaten her, that she was done, withering away and passing out of memory in the dark under the mountains. Obviously, that was a bad bit of wishful thinking. Kai stood there and looked at the trees. The monkey she'd seen earlier was swinging about high in the branches. This strange assortment of animals had to have come from the grand animalium that Carahil said was around here somewhere. Carahil continued on. The Black Abbess was far from done. Safe in the darkness, she snared the tunnels to keep out the sisters and the Vith, the Blues, and there she remained for centuries, continuing her studies, luring in and enslaving the weak sisters and the Vith who dared to come too close. To those followers she imparted her love of pain and suffering, and they kept her fresh and new Shadowtech meat. Eventually, after the great betrayal, she took her followers and fled to the Zaffins, and eventually, the Black Hats. Kai swallowed hard and watched the monkey climb up a tall, curved tree with a white trunk. She could see the ruins of the Tartan Temple far off to the south. I thought all that was just folklore. Oh, I'm afraid not. All that and more happened right here. These holes, the hazards of the old ones, is where the Black River once flowed. And here, countless unhappy females were dragged into the interior, never to be seen again. Only their screams were heard, drifting pitifully out of the holes, carrying on the wind, and all the old blue-haired Vith heroes and even the sisters were powerless to enter and save them. On her victim's pain, the Black Abbess invented the Sten, the Point, the Mass, the Phantom Hand, and others, first issuing out of these holes to kill and cause fear, and then, when Magravine and her followers fled to the Zaffins, they abandoned these tunnels, leaving behind only ghosts and despair and bad dreams. Do enough evil, and a place can become evil as well. So yes, as you mentioned before, this place is evil. Kai took a few steps back. Her imagination began to run away with her. She noticed the white tree the monkey was climbing wasn't actually a tree. It was smooth and shiny like a whalebone or a tusk. There was another white tree nearby in a similar shape to the first one. A pair of tusks, but they were impossibly huge. There was a dark shape behind the tusks, so square and massive Kai hadn't acknowledged it as a shape at all, something that spanned the treetops. She thought she could see it moving slightly. Carahil, is that the elephant you were talking about? Carahil turned his head. Yes. Well, what is it? Where'd it come from? Should we get away or something? A cat wandered out from the trees and licked its paws. It stared at them, and Kai thought she could see red eyes. Don't go in there, came a soft voice. Kai held her bag and stared. How could this be? Did the cat just talk? Carahil seemed nonplussed. Do go away, he said. The pink bird took flight and the monkey bounded into the trees. The great bulk of the elephant slowly turned away. The cat sat there a moment. It sat with purpose and grim intent.
You'll be sorry,
it said as it padded into the trees and vanished. Carahil twitched his whiskers. Now then, where were we? What was that? Kai cried. Did that cat just talk? Yes. Cats can't talk. Well, neither can seals normally. But here we are, chatting away. Let's suffice to say, that really isn't a cat. Well, what is it then? She considered recent events. Is that what's been leaving the messages? Is that Mayax? That's not Mayax. Let's not lose focus, shall we? They're gone. And let us return to the task at hand. Somewhat dubiously, Kai turned back to the tunnels. Wind circled around the mouths of the holes. Noise came out of the tunnels. The tunnels began moaning. Don't go in there, she heard again. You hear that? Kai said as casually as she could. I didn't hear anything. She could see a few feet into the tunnels, but no further. A wall of cloudy dark was hopelessly entrenched within. The dark was oily and swirling. Kai imagined she could see hints of the Black Abbess dancing in the folds, wagging a finger, a bit of red cloth. A demon in female form, reveling in the torment, beckoning her to enter. She looked back at the ruins far in the distance to the south. The odd animals were gone, and she could follow with her eyes the path the Black River took, the Shadowtech flowing from all those dead girls. The wind picked up a little, making a whiny sort of drone against the mouths of the tunnels, but other than that, there was no sound. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing, nothing. Even the purplish ground cover that gave these mountains their distinctive lavender shade didn't grow near the holes. They were bare orange stone. Life seemed to want to avoid these tunnels. I've no hankering to go in there myself, Kylos. You must believe me, but I do what I must. I protect and serve, and to do that, I must go in. I must prevent what is to come. And you also must go in. You also must prevent what is to come. Carahil, hey, we've a job to perform, Kylos. The sooner we begin, the sooner we finish, Carahil said, moving toward the third tunnel from the left. Kylos, her eyes wide, fixed on the hole, gripped her bag. Her hands were shaking again. Listen, before we start, I need to know what we're doing here. I need a mission breakdown, and I need to know what my role was going to be. You promised to tell me. She could hear her fear in her own voice, the panic. Well, I certainly did. We're going to go in the third tunnel here. We're going to feel around in the dark for a few miles until we come to the heart. There, you will search for a bright stone and secure it. A bright stone, what's that? Sounds familiar. A bit of the arcane I've had my eye on for some time now. It's a barrel, roughly spherical, blue, green, pink, or clear jewels. Very pretty, actually. How big? About as large as your fist. There's actually quite a few of them in there. We only need one. You may take your pick. The color will matter not, but please, pick a pretty one by all means. And I'm getting this bright stone for you? You're not going to get it? Correct. If I could retrieve a bright stone on my own, I would have done so by now. I cannot. Therefore, I need you to fetch one for me. And what do you need me to do with it? I need you, once you've secured one, to put it in my mouth. Put it in your mouth. Yes. Is that all? Do you need to chew it or swallow it? I will need to swallow it, yes. Excellent question, Kylos. All right. Then what? Then we leave. We exit the tunnels. Easy enough, yes? That's all? That's all. Why is this bright stone so important? What do you want it for? Because I currently cannot be in more than one place at a time. I will have a need to be in many places at once. If we are to save those we love, the bright stone will allow me to do that. Kylos stood. Who are we saving everybody from? The Black Hats. They've gone mad. They want blood, and they don't care where it comes from. They also wish to make a point for all to see, and that point will be bought by the death of billions. Kai gripped her bag and looked at the tunnels again. And if we don't do this here, they will have the blood of everyone we love, and more, much more. She swallowed. All right, for my friends, for Dav and Sig, I will do this. You're not going to disappear on me in there, are you? I shall do my best to survive the whole way. And with that, we conclude Part 2, Chapter 9, The Hazards of the Old Ones. Lots of information conveyed in that chapter, lots of stuff going on. So this place, it's kind of in the middle of nowhere in the upper continent. The Hazards of the Old Ones has a lot of history to it. There was a precursor city supposedly there from the people who were on Kana before the League arrived. Those were aliens that are covered in the Temple of the Exploding Head book, and they fled Kana after the League arrived, and they had huge cities with no windows that they leveled to the ground and destroyed as much as they could and kind of wiped Kana clean. So when the League arrived, Kana was basically bare. The only thing that was really there were the monomas to the south. They mentioned these grand animaliums, and those are 7 stations that the elders put there. And they're elder tech, and they're beyond League tech, so they're buried deep in the ground, and they're defended with elder magic, basically, that affects your senses. You could be standing in one of these grand animaliums and not know it. At Magravine, at the bottom of the chasm, is a grand animalium, and what they are is the League had undergone a long journey with the elders over time, starting at Earth millions of years ago, and then they went to Lemuria, and then Amira, and then to Camera, and then to Ing, and then finally to Kana. And along the way, on all these planets, they collected flora and fauna and kept them in stasis. So they have plant and animal life from all these worlds, Earth included. That's why there's all these familiar animals roaming around Kana. And they put these embryos, these frozen embryos, in these grand animaliums, and over time, they automatically are nurtured and brought into being and then turned loose. So all these varying animals and all these seeds that are set out on the wind began to repopulate Kana, because the older ones, the precursors, had stripped Kana bare. It really had no life left on it except for the monomas. So these grand animaliums repopulate. It's like they talk about the Nadine trees up north, and those are actually native of Ing, as we saw in the Shadow Tech Goddess. So that's those grand animaliums at work. So there's one there at the Hazards of the Old Ones. And then you have the story of Magravine, one of the 25 grand abbesses of the Sisterhood of Light. She was the sister of Subra of the Mark, who is sort of a mythological figure in Vith history. Subra was the first Shadow Tech female, basically, and Shadow Tech was kind of unknown to the League back then, and then Magravine began researching it. And if you read the Shadow Tech Goddess books, Paymaster Stenstrom, wearing a Vith artifact, encounters a simulacrum or ancient vestige of the Grand Abbess of Magravine at the bottom of the ruins of Magravine. And he found she was, well, a little stuffy and fastidious, but she was far from cruel or evil or mean. He lamented that eventually she would go mad and become this horrific demon, reveling in pain and delights like that. He lamented that what she became and what was lost in the process. And so after she was forced out of her temple, the Black Abbess relocated here and bore these huge holes in the mountain and began harvesting Shadow Tech from Vith girls. And you see that kind of tree-like image. That's supposed to be a dead girl leaking Shadow Tech, and she collected it and would do stuff with this Shadow Tech. She invented all sorts of things. The Black Hats continued to collect Shadow Tech. As we saw, Cat was continuously milked for her Shadow Tech. And there's these 6 holes in the mountains. Part of world building is adding mundane things to make the world more full, give it some depth. And so the old Vith lords would come to this place just to test their courage, see how far they can get in to these holes, and they was usually never far. And then eventually they said, well, it's too creepy going in these holes where the Black Abbess used to torture people, so we'll just stay out here in the sunlight and have lunch in the proximity of these holes, a hazard's lunch, as it was called. Just a little world building fact. And you see on the cover Kai holding her SK and Carahil, and there's these caves all around. Here, this is a picture of my wife. That's my wife there wearing the coat, and she's supposed to be Kai, and she's holding a water pistol, and the Tweety next to her is supposed to be Carahil, and that's what I sent my artist Carol Phillips when we were coming up with this cover. I'm like, here's what I envisioned, Kai and Carahil, and then staring off into the distance at these creepy holes, and you see how Carol took that and reimagined it a little. Instead of from dead behind, it's kind of to the side, and very nice composition. I've always liked it. Carahil's going on and telling Kai this creepy story. Growing up on Onaris, Kai would hear a lot of stories about Kana and the creepy things that were supposed to be there. The Vith who acted like gods, and the giants who were the Hytath warriors of old, and that the devil lived on Kana, and the Black Abbess is supposed to be the devil. And here's where the devil lived. The Hazards of the Old Ones. Carahil wants her to go in and fetch him a bright stone. And if you recall, in the prologue, when Carahil was talking about all the things he needs to save this mysterious planet, one of the things that he needed to fortify himself with was a bright stone. And they are artifacts. And as we saw, he left a book open for Kai in the mains library, talking about the Brightstones, how there's over 10,000 of them, and they were created by the elders to power the various arcane devices that they would create. And after the elders passed, these sisters, always wanting to hoard things for themselves, collected all 10,000 plus Brightstones, and it was called the tasks of Va and Fockwell, and that was the beginning of the Stellar Fleet. That was their first task, was to venture out to quest for these Brightstones. In my D&D days, I always loved dealing with artifacts. It just added spice to the story, and I made sure to populate my league with lots of artifacts, and the Brightstones are just one of them. There's a lot of other artifacts floating around that we deal with at the Noabs, which were gifts from the elders that the sisters once again hoarded, and then every so often Paramel, the lantern, one of the 25 Noabs, would escape and go out amongst the people and do amazing things. Artifacts are always fun. Throw in there and add a little touch of mystery to the mundane world around it. In any event, that was that. I hope it was suitably creepy, so that they're going to go into one of these holes, these hazards of the old ones, and Kai is going to fetch Carahil a Brightstone. There's a very specific reason why Carahil picked Kai to come with him, and essentially she's the only person who can do this, just because she's not a Vith Blue. She's a peasant from Onaris, a Johnny, as keeps bringing that up. There's a specific reason why a Onaris person, a non-Vith, a non-blue, can go in these places where the Vith cannot, as the old snares and the old traps that the Black Abyss left in these holes are still there, and they are deadly to the Vith, but not to the Johnnies of Onaris, who are basically immune to these traps and these snares, but falter when it comes to the lore, to the mythology, how scared Kai was, because these stories had been beaten into her, well, not beaten into her, but ingrained into her as a kid, and just these creepy stories that are just part of her childhood, part of her persona. When you come face to face with it, not very many people are going to have the guts to actually go into one of these holes and check out what's there, because bad things are supposed to be there. But we'll see what happens next week when we go on to part 2, chapter 10, Heron. So we're going to start getting a lot of things happening in a lot of different places. So Kai and Carahil are about to go into the creepy hazards. And then Heron, we see Captain Davidge square off at last with Princess Rock of Xandar. So don't think I forgot about her. I haven't. Not indeed. So until then, this is Ren Presents. I am your host, Ren. Peace out.